Going to be the base frame assembly, and before we get started we need to gather our parts. You're going to need a cell phone or a tablet, and this is going to be for our build manual. My build manual has been designed for a swipe action on a cell phone or tablet. This will allow easy reading while you're working on your project. The next thing you're going to need is your aluminum extrusion. You're going to need 2 aluminum extrusions, 20 by 60, 500 millimeters long. You're going to need 3 20 by 60 aluminum extrusions, 380 millimeters long. You're going to need 12 end caps, 16 90-degree corners. The cast corners will work as well. You're going to need 44 M5 by 8 millimeter bolts, and you're going to need 48 M5 T-nuts. Optionally, depending on how you're going to mount your work surface, in my case I'll be using a combination wood and metal spoiler board, you're going to need some additional T-nuts to place in your V-slot for later use. So the first thing you want to do is on each end of this 20 by 60, tap them for M5 threads. You want to do that to both 500 millimeter long extrusions. It is not necessary for the 380 millimeter long extrusions. Once you get that done, we're going to go ahead and lay out our parts. You also want a ruler of some kind. Steel rule like this works just fine, and tape measure will work fine. You just want to make sure it has metric measurements. This, for the most part, is a completely metric machine. Alright, so what we want to do is preload our T-nuts into the V-slot. And in the build manual, you have a diagram showing you where all the T-nuts go. So on the lower 500 millimeter long extrusion, the one closest to you, we are going to place 6 T-nuts. On the outside edge of the same piece of extrusion, we are going to place 8 T-nuts. You can go ahead and lay that one flat again. Now on the back piece of 500 millimeter long extrusion, we're going to do the same. 6 on the inside edge and 8 on the outside. In the center 20 by 60, we want 2 T-nuts on each outside slot. like so. On the outside 20 by 60, we want 2 T-nuts on the inside slot, and we want 4 T-nuts on the outside slot. Just like that. And do the same on the other piece. 2 on the inside slot, 4 on the outside. Just like that. Oops, excuse me, I had that backwards. The 2 need to go on the inside. 4 go towards the outside. Go ahead and kind of lay out your 90-degree corners in the relative position they'll be in, just so we know what we're doing. Now the last 4 get placed in a vertical orientation. These will also be to help secure our Y-axis linear rail in a later stage. Now taking our M5 by 8mm screws, we want to go ahead and lightly secure the T-nuts in place. And that is how your outside 20 by 60 will look. This is how your 2 middle ones are to be positioned, with the flat facing up. Both the left and right outside ones will be assembled in the same way. This is how your middle 20 by 60 will be assembled. 2 corner connectors, top and bottom, secured with M5 by 8mm bolts. And for this side, we're going to repeat the same as we did for the other. And just as the other side, this is how this 20 by 60 should be assembled. The 2 center will be facing outside. Next, grab your end caps and place 3 on each side. These are merely cosmetic. If you want to, you can leave them out. These will also be secured by M5 by 8mm bolts. Now before you cap off this last end, you want to take into account how are you going to secure your spoiler board. In my build here, I'll be having a base with a MDF spoiler board that's replaceable, and so I need to insert an additional few T-nuts in the innermost slot on top. I'm going to do 2. And this is going to help secure my spoiler board system. Once we've done that, we can continue to cap off our V-slot. do the same to the other 500 millimeter long 20 by 60. Once you have those 5 done, leave this one open again so we can secure 2 M5 T-nuts. And that's what you should end up with. This slot here will be the one you have the 2 additional T-nuts to secure your spoiler board. Now we're ready to secure our 5 pieces of pre-assembled 20 by 60 to make our base frame. We are going to place some additional T-nuts in each internal 20 by 60 V slot. We want to do 2 on the innermost slot, excuse me. The innermost slot would be the one towards the center of your machine. For the center, 2 in the center slot. And on this 20 by 60 V slot, we're going to place 2 on the innermost slot as well. And that concludes all the additional T-nuts we'll need to secure the spoiler board. We spaced the center 20 by 60 to 140 millimeter gap here and 140 millimeter gap here. At this point, we can go ahead and space (120 millimeters) from the edge of the V-slot to the edge of the upright 90-degree corner. Let's go ahead and adjust them so they're both equal. This is just so they're centered. It's not going to affect anything else. which should leave you with a gap of 100 millimeters in between. Your gap should be 100 millimeters in between the two upright 90s and 120 on the outside to the V-slot. Go ahead and do that to both sides. And go ahead and square up your frame in whatever method you prefer, and that will conclude the base frame assembly. You'll have 10 additional T-nuts placed throughout your frame on the top for securing your spoiler board at a later time. Let's move on to the next step. Linear rail assembly. You'll be needing 2 of these. In this video, I'll be going over how to assemble the left Y-axis linear rail assembly. For the parts that we're going to be needing today, you'll need your left side Y-axis plate, your left front Y-axis bearing plate, your left rear Y-axis motor mount plate in NEMA 23 motor, 500mm long C-beam, your TR8x8 lead screw, 2 688 2Z flanged bearings, 2 8mm lock collars, 8mm by 1/4 inch coupler, 4 40mm spacers, 4 M5 by 50mm bolts, 2 M5 by 30mm bolts, 8 M5 by 27mm bolts, 4 M5 by 25mm bolts, 8 M5 by 15mm bolts, 14 M5 lock nuts, 2 M5 T-nuts, 4 6mm spacers, 6 6mm eccentric spacers, 4 3mm spacers, 2 8mm shims, 2 anti-backlash nuts. You can also use 1 anti-backlash nut or a regular Durlin nut. 8 assembled mini V-wheel kits with the additional shim they come with. 2 solid V-wheel kits. You will not be needing the additional shim they come with. Another thing to keep in mind when assembling your Y-axis linear rails is my plate designs. You have to consider how you're going to be tensioning your lead screw. I've designed my plates for the Y-axis to be a mirror image of each other left to right. Now this has several benefits, including one of which is allowing you to choose whether you want to put your lead screw in tension or in compression to tighten it. For this assembly, I'll be doing as a C-beam linear rail, and I'll be putting it under compression. So the first thing you want to do is grab your 500mm long C-beam and the left motor mount plate. Set the other plates aside for now. You're also going to need 4 M5 by 15mm long bolts. So grab your bolts, your plate, and your C-beam. The remainder of the parts can be set aside for now. Alright, you're also going to need a 3mm hex wrench. Flange bearing pocket face the center of the C-beam. Once you got your bolts started, go ahead and tighten them up. That will be your rear motor mount plate installed. And if you're going to be putting your lead screw in tension, you'd be using the other plate. Alright, let's move on. And keep in mind, we have our build manual on our phone or tablet, so following each step is as easy as swiping. For our next step, we're going to need our NEMA 23 motor, our 4 40mm spacers, our 4 M5 by 50 millimeter bolts. As well as our 8 millimeter 2/4 inch coupler. Go ahead and loosen up the bolts in the coupler. That's how it's ready for you to assemble. The way this is going to assemble is pretty easy. We want our wire of the NEMA 23 motor to be facing the inside of our machine, which will be the flat side of our C-beam. Go ahead and take your M5 bolts. Get them started through your motor. Like so. And then put on your spacers. This might be a little awkward to do, but just don't turn it back too far and you'll be able to get it on there. You just want to make sure your M5s don't fall out. Keeping the wire to the center, we will now secure it to our rear motor mount plate. The 4 holes for the NEMA 23 motor are already tapped for M5 bolts. At this point, we can go ahead and set this entire assembly aside for the moment. The next step is assembling your side plate. You're going to need your side plate, your 6 millimeter eccentrics, you're going to need 6 of them, your 6 millimeter spacers, you're going to need 4 of those, you're going to need your 4 3 millimeter spacers, two M5 by 30 millimeter bolts. You're going to need 4 M5 by 25 millimeter bolts, 8 M5 by 27 millimeter bolts. Considering this as the top and this is the bottom, from the top of your side plate, you have M5 by 30s with 6 millimeter eccentrics. The middle row is M5 by 27s with 6 millimeter spacers. The bottom row is M5 by 27 with 6 millimeter eccentrics. The center 4 are M5 by 25s with 3 millimeter spacers. Now we want to take our 2 anti-backlash nuts, our precision 1 millimeter shims from the mini V-wheel kits, and our 2 full-size wheels, as well as our mini wheels. Now, the lower 2 rows are going to get your precision 1 millimeter shim. You're going to need 8 mini V wheels fully assembled and 2 larger wheels fully assembled. Your larger wheels, your full size I should say, solid wheels will be on the top 2 M5 by 30s with 6 millimeter eccentrics. And your mini wheels will go on the middle and bottom rows. Alright, now we're going to head and loosely mount our anti-backlash nuts. Like so. And the other side's going to be rotated 180 degrees and the hex nut will be on top. Alright, so now we're going to take our M5 lock nuts, and we're also going to need an 8 millimeter wrench. Alright, so let's go ahead and tighten up the spacers and the eccentric nuts on the wheels, and leave the eccentric nuts tight enough to keep in position but loose enough that you can easily adjust it. You don't want to tighten that down fully. You can go ahead and tighten down the spacers fully at this time. I've made a mistake on my CAD file that I sent out to get my plates made. So if you're making this from revision 1 of this plates, the first CAD files I posted, I should have spaced these appropriately for an 8mm pitch lead screw, and it looks like they're a little too close together, and you can't thread the lead screw all the way through with that spacing. To give you an example of what I mean here, they can be butted up against each other, which was my original design, but then I chose to have the additional hole in the center. They can be one rotation from each other, which is further apart than I currently have my bolt hole spacings. So we all make mistakes. That's one that I wasn't accounting for. I should have thought about that, but that's all right. What we're going to do is we're going to set our secondary anti-backlash nut to the side for the moment. We'll come back at a later time with the updated plates to add the dual anti-backlash nuts. For now, remove one anti-backlash nut, and one set of bolts, the M5x25s, and we'll use the center bowl and do a single anti-backlash nut configuration. So to those who have already built their plates, I apologize, run single anti-backlash nut. And what we're doing now is adjusting the anti-backlash. So go ahead and remove your lead screw now. We have the backlash nut tightened, and set your lead screw to the side. Now we want to adjust our eccentrics on our plate. So bring back the C-beam from earlier. And this will take a little bit of time, a little bit of finesse to get it right. But the pattern we're going to adjust it in is we're going to adjust these two inner ones first, and then we'll adjust these two outer ones, and then we'll adjust these two top ones. Our lower mini wheels are already adjusted, so all we're going to do, as you can see how they're loose right now, we're going to take our 8mm wrench and adjust the eccentrics until they tighten. Alright, so everything is secured. Our plate is good to go. We have really smooth linear motion. At this point, this is what our assembly looks like. Alright, go ahead and set it down. Now we're going to move on to our next step. We're going to need our lead screw, our 8mm shims, our flanged bearings, and our 2 T-nuts. The 4 M5 by 15mm bolts we're not going to use right now. It's for a later step. So you can set them aside. First thing we're going to do is scoot your plate to be in the middle. I'm going to grab a flanged bearing, and with the flanged side of the bearing facing towards the center of the C-beam, insert it into your machined plate. That will be a nice, secure, flush bearing. No wobble, no extra play. And at this point, we'll go ahead and thread our lead screw back through our anti-backlash nut. And once we got that, go ahead and throw on an 8mm lock collar on the front and an 8mm lock collar on the rear, followed by an 8mm shim on the front and an 8mm shim on the rear. Now what you want to do is you want to push all the way back till your lead screw goes into the bearing, or should I say through the bearing and into your coupler. Now you notice that hits the motor. You want to back it off just a little bit. You don't want it to actually hit the shaft of the motor. So back it off a couple of millimeters. And we now want to secure our coupler. Now make sure your bearing is flush in the plate. Take your 8mm shim, push it up against the bearing. Take your lock collar, push it up against the shim. We're going to go ahead and secure this rear lock collar in place. Now take your 2 M5 T-nuts, and they're going to be positioned on the outside bottom V-slot. That's going to be the V-slot closest to your plate on the lower side. Just chuck them in there. Like so. Grab your last flanged bearing and your front bearing mount. Install the bearing into the plate. Again, it should have no play and be flush. Now we can grab those M5 by 50mm bolts we set aside earlier and bolt the front bearing plate to the front of the C-beam linear actuator. Now that you've had that tensioned, just lightly, we're going to go ahead and back it off a quarter turn. We want to loosen all 4 bolts, just a quarter turn. We're going to put some tension on our lead screw. You don't want too much because you can buckle your lead screw, putting it in tension, or excuse me, putting it in compression. But you do want some. So just take your hand, push the lead screw in with your thumb, hold the lock collar as tightly as possible up against the plate. Grab your hex wrench and lock the lock collar down. Now we can fully tighten the front. Now that our lead screw is in alignment with the bearings, we can finally tighten the anti-backlash nut down. Now I like to do this in the full rear rearward position. So go ahead and turn your lead screw by hand until you get it in the full backwards position. But now that's in its full rear position, we can go ahead and tighten it down. Grab your M3 hex wrench and tighten it. Now again, we don't want this too tight. You can compress your anti-backlash nut, rendering it deformed. Alright, and so there we have one Y-axis linear actuator. This is going to be the left. Go ahead and follow the same steps to assemble your right. Again, if you are building this video with version 1 plates, version 1 plates are going to be the files that were posted prior to July 5th. Do not install your dual anti-backlash nuts. If you are working from revision 2 plates, go ahead and install the dual anti-backlash nuts. They will be modified and revised to allow the proper spacing. Alright, let's go ahead and move on to the next step after you've assembled your second Y-axis linear actuator. You have the Y-axis linear rails assembled. You should have a left and a right unit. Let's go ahead and grab our 3 base components and start our assembly. To make assembly things easier, you'll want to rotate your base frame so the 500mm long V-slots are on your left and your right. This will make putting on your linear rails a little easier. So let's go ahead and set one of them to the side for now. And then grab your first V-slot linear rail for your Y-axis. You're also going to need 4 M5 by 8mm bolts and 16 M5 by 10mm bolts. You'll also want an M3 hex wrench and some sort of long steel rule. It's just a Pittsburgh I picked up from Harbor Freight for a couple bucks. Now the plate to the V-slot is a tight fit, so to make installing it and sliding it over the V-slot easier, let's go ahead and grab our 3mm hex wrench and loosen the plates, and we'll retighten everything and readjust our bearings once we get it on. We can see it slides right on. Alright, so adjust that. This is the back of the C-beam, so the front of the C-beam to be flush with your top and bottom 20 by 60s. Again, we'll worry about squaring it all up later. At this stage, we can go ahead and retighten those screws we loosened. Perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and rotate the whole assembly so I can access the T-nuts that we pre-installed on the 20 by 60. They should line up for the most part, but if they didn't, you can always just tilt your machine. Like so. Alright, so the next step of the process is going to be using the M5 by 8mm bolts to come up from the bottom and secure our T-nuts, or excuse me, our 90-degree corner brackets to the bottom side of the C-beam. So I am going to have to hang the machine over the back side of the table here to do that. linear rail y-axis secured to the base frame assembly. So we have our aluminum plates secured to the lower base frame with 4 M5 by 10mm bolts each, and then the two 90-degree corner connectors are secured up into the bottom of the C-beam. As you can see, our y-axis linear rail goes to the edge of the V-slot, but does not overhang the end caps. Let's go ahead and do the exact same steps to our other y-axis linear rails. Oh yeah, look at that. Slides right on. There we go. Alright, so again we want to tilt the whole machine to get access to our T-nuts. And because we have the bolts installed on our other y-axis, it will prevent the T-nuts from getting trapped. Just like that. Grab the X wrench and scoot them into place. In here, and we're going to secure the last two 90-degree corner connectors with M5 by 8mm bolts. And there we have our completed step. Now, what we want to do is take our long steel rule, or in this case aluminum ruler. I want to make sure the gap between the two linear rails is the same front and rear. And that should be 420mm. If for whatever reason that's off, go ahead and adjust things so they are parallel with each other. We also want to grab our engineer square and make sure our rails are square with our base frame. And this side's pretty darn good. Alright, looks like we're good. And there we have it. Our completed base frame. Today we're going to be working on our Z-axis, and the parts we're going to need are a 250mm long C-beam, 250mm long TR8 by 8 lead screw, 2 C-beam end plates, belt reduction mount, a 40-tooth GT3 pulley, a 20-tooth GT3 pulley, a closed loop GT3 timing belt, your NEMA 23 motor, 2 8mm lock collars, 3 8mm shims, 2 6 88Z bearing, your double wide gantry plate, an anti-backlash nut, 2 3mm spacers, 4 6mm spacers, 4 6mm eccentrics, 14 M5 lock nuts, 4 M5 by 15mm bolts, 4 M5 by 20mm bolts, and 14 M5 by 25mm bolts. And finally, we'll need 12 M5 T-nuts. So to get started, we are going to push a couple of these things out of our way and grab our double wide gantry plate. Now on one side you'll notice we have smaller holes than the other, and that's for our eccentric nuts. So go ahead and grab your M5 by 25 bolts and load them into your plate. You're going to need a total of 8. Go ahead and flip your plate over. You're going to want to take your 6mm eccentric spacers and inserting them into the 7.2mm holes over your M5 by 25mm bolts, and go ahead and adjust them so that way when you put your wheels on, they're in their loose setting. They have a little mark on the eccentric. On the other 4 M5 by 25mm bolts, we're going to place 6mm spacers. On top of all 8, we're going to place our 1mm precision shim that's included with our mini V-wheel kits. Now that we have that done, go ahead and install our mini V-wheels onto our M5 by 25mm bolts. We're now going to secure them in place with our M5 lock nuts. Using our 8mm wrench and our 3mm hex wrench, go ahead and tighten all this up. We want to have our eccentrics snug but not tight. We want to be able to adjust our eccentrics later. Go ahead and snug the spacer side completely up. Now that we have all of our mini wheels secured in place, go ahead and put 2 M5 by 25mm bolts into the lower center 2 positions. Grab your anti-backlash nut, your 3mm spacers. First install your 3mm spacers, and then your anti-backlash nut. Alright, there we have our anti-backlash nut installed. Do not over tighten at this point, leave it a little loose. We want it to self-align on our lead screw once we have the full assembly on our C-beam with our bearings installed. Alright, so grab your TR8 by 8 lead screw and go ahead and thread it through your nut block. We're going to be adjusting our backlash. To adjust our backlash, you'll need a hex wrench, as well as your 8mm wrench. And there we have our lead screw properly adjusted to remove any backlash. Go ahead and remove the lead screw at this point, and we're going to proceed with adjusting our mini V-wheels. You'll need your assembled gantry plate and your 250mm C-beam. And we're going to adjust our eccentrics on our mini V wheels, and we'll start with the center two, then the outside two. Just take your time and adjust them one at a time until you get it right. Now that we have our eccentrics adjusted and we're happy with our tension on the wheels, we can go ahead and tighten up all of our M5 and 25mm bolts and lock nuts. Alright, so now that we have our double wide gantry plate adjusted, go ahead and slide it down to the bottom and we'll be installing our NEMA 23 motor. We're going to need our NEMA 23 motor, our double wide gantry plate, one of our C-beam end plates. We're going to need 4 M5 by 15s, as well as 4 M5 by 25s. We're also going to need our 4 remaining M5 lock nuts. So to begin, we're going to take our C-beam end plate, place it on top of our C-beam. We're going to take our plate and we're going to align our holes on top of the C-beam end plate. Like so. Go ahead and put your M5 by 25mm bolts. And that's what we should have. C-beam, C-beam end plate, butt reduction plate secured with M5 by 25mm bolts. We're now going to mount our NEMA 23 motor. Now I like to position the wire facing towards the rear of the Z-axis. Using your M5 by 15mm bolts and your M5 lock nuts, we're going to secure this in place. And we have our NEMA 23 motor mounted to our belt reduction plate. Go ahead and leave it a little loose so you can slide it back and forth. Later we'll be adjusting the tension on our belt. Alright, looking at the back of our Z-axis C-beam, we want to preload 12 T-nuts into these 4 slots. On the bottom slot, having it laying on its side, you want 2 T-nuts. Next slot up, you're going to want 4 T-nuts. Third slot, again 4 T-nuts. The very top slot, 2 additional T-nuts. What we should end up with is the back of our C-beam should have the outside slots 2 T-nuts each, the interior 2 slots should have 4 T-nuts each. Go ahead and grab your last C-beam end plate. Install your bearing. Grab your lead screw and thread it through your double wide gantry plate. When your lead screw starts getting close to the top, install your last bearing into the C-beam plate. And on the top of the lead screw, we want to put an 8mm lock collar, follow it up by a 8mm shim. At that point, we can go ahead and thread our lead screw through our bearing. On the bottom, we want to install our 8mm lock collar, an 8mm shim, and our C-beam end plate. Once we have our lower C-beam end plate secured to our Z-axis, and we're going to tighten our top lock collar. Go ahead and press it up against the top C-beam plate as tight as you can and secure the set screw. We want to put a little bit of tension into our lead screw by compressing it a little bit, but we don't want to do much, so just back off your screws a full quarter turn and go ahead and tighten your lower lock collar. And we should end up flush to the bottom with a tight lead screw and our lock collar secured in place. Trimming our lead screw by hand, we should have free linear motion up and down for our Z-axis. Go ahead and transverse it through the length of its travel. Make sure you don't have any binding. Now that it's made a full travel up and down, we know that our anti-backlash nut is in alignment with our lead screw, and we can go ahead and tighten that down for the last time. Just like so. The nylock nuts will actually secure everything in place and it won't come loose. Alright, so at that point, this is what we have. The rattling here in the back should be our T-nuts. Now we can install our belt reduction system. Begin by installing our 40 tooth pulley. This will be the larger of the two. It has a socket head cap screw. It uses the same hex wrench as our lock collars. Go ahead and loosen it up. And we want to install an 8mm shim before installing our 40 tooth pulley. Once we have the larger 40 tooth GT3 pulley installed on the top of our 8mm lead screw, we can go ahead and install our smaller 20 tooth pulley onto our NEMA 23 motor. Once we have our pulleys adjusted, we can go ahead and pull our motor all the way back and tighten our motor mount bolts. And that will conclude our Z-axis assembly. The next step, our X-axis assembly. You will need the following parts: a 503mm long piece of C-beam, a NEMA 23 motor, 4 40mm spacers, 4 M5 by 50mm bolts, 1 8mm to 1/4 inch coupler, 12 M5 by 10mm bolts, 8 M5 by 15mm bolts, 4 M5 by 25mm bolts, 6 M5 by 60mm, a 530mm long TR 8x8 lead screw, 2 lock collars, 2 8mm shims, 2 688 2Z bearings, your X-axis front plate, your X-axis rear plate, 2 anti-backlash nuts, 4 6mm spacers, 6 6mm spacers, 6 9mm spacers, 6 6mm eccentrics, 6 10mm outside diameter shims, 10 M5 lock nuts, and 12 V-wheel kits. As you can see, today we are going to be installing a singular anti-backlash nut. The files posted before July 5th have the wrong spacing on these outside 2 holes, so you can only run a single anti-backlash nut in the single position. Okay, now that we've rearranged some of our parts and made a little more room, we're going to go ahead and start by taking our rear X-axis plate and installing our anti-backlash nut. The bolt head recesses will be towards the outside, so we're going to install our anti-backlash nut on the side with no recesses. Go ahead and grab your 2 M5 by 25mm bolts and insert them through the 2 center holes. Secure it in place with 2 M5 nylocks. And there we have our anti-backlash nut installed. Remember to leave it a touch loose. We'll actually tighten it up once we have it riding on the lead screw to guarantee the nut block's in alignment. Next, we're going to thread through our TR 8x8 lead screw and adjust out any backlash nut the nut may have. To adjust the anti-backlash nut and remove any backlash, you're going to need a hex wrench and an 8mm wrench. Next, we want to start installing our wheels. So grab your front X-axis plate, that would be the one with the 12 holes in the center, and your M5 by 60mm bolts. You want to load a single bolt in each hole. 3 on the bottom, 3 on the top. Now when we're loading everything up, keep in mind your larger 7.2mm holes for your eccentrics will be the bottom of the X-axis. We're going to start by placing our 6mm eccentrics on the lower set of bolts. On the top set of bolts, we're going to install a 6mm shim. On top of those, we're now going to install our 1mm precision shim that's included with our V-wheel kits. After that, go ahead and install your full-size V-wheels. On top of the V-wheels, we will now be installing a 9mm shim. This will give us the appropriate spacing to run dual wheels on the C-beam. On top of your 9mm spacers, go ahead and install the remainder of your V-wheels. On top of your V-wheels, go ahead and install a 6mm shim on top, and on bottom install your eccentrics, making sure the tab that goes into your plate is facing up. Like so. We can now take our rear plate, turn it upside down, and install it over our bolts. Once you have all your eccentrics and bolts through the entire sandwich of wheels, spacers, and front and rear X-axis plates, we're now going to install our remainder 6 1mm precision shims. Now we can secure everything together using M5 lock nuts. Axis gantry should now look like. The next thing we want to do is adjust all of our eccentrics so we have the mark facing down towards the edge of the plate. That way they're all in the same plane when we go to adjust them. Now that we have all the eccentrics facing the same direction, we're going to start adjusting them on our C-beam linear row, and we're going to begin by adjusting the 2 center followed by the 2 outside, and we want to make sure that the 2 on the same bolt are adjusted equally so they have even pressure throughout. Now that we have our eccentrics fully adjusted and right where we want them, we can go ahead and secure everything in place. A couple tricks to getting all 6 of these eccentrics adjusted evenly is to start with your center 2, and once they're even and adjusted appropriately, tighten that nut. You want to secure it in place. That way it will prevent it from moving while you're adjusting the other 4. Then I like to start with this corner up here on the left, and then go, once you have that one tightened and adjusted, go diagonal and adjust the opposite lower corner, and then do the one next to it, and then go back diagonal and adjust. And there we have our fully adjusted X-axis gantry plate and our eccentric wheels with our anti-backlash nut installed. As you can see, we have really nice, smooth, linear motion. You should have 0 play, yet 0 drag. Alright, now we can go ahead and remove your x-axis gantry, set your x-axis C-beam to the side, and then grab the z-axis we assembled in a previous step. We're now going to install it on our x-axis gantry plate. To install this to the plate, we're going to be using our M5 by 10 millimeter bolts. You're going to need a total of 12. And I find the easiest way to do this is just kind of set your z-axis upside down. Hold your plate up next to it so we can kind of get our T-nuts in alignment. And then place our plate over the top and just slowly start threading in your M5s. This will now we have our x-axis gantry installed onto our z-axis. All the 12 M5 by 10 millimeter bolts are engaging our T-nuts. We want to make sure they're not fully tightened yet. We will be adjusting our gantry plates now. Once we have it loose so we can adjust it up and down, this is where the design of my plates will really come in handy. You have a nice square flat bottom, and these inside cutouts are exactly 80 millimeters wide. So you want to align your bottom edge with either the top of your C-beam end plate or with the bottom of your C-beam end plate. I'll go ahead and install mine today with the top edge of my C-beam plate. That will have my C-beam hanging down a little more than necessary. You can also install it so that way the bottom edges are in alignment. It's up to you. Your next alignment is going to be on the side. Once you have it in alignment, double check both sides. Hold it in place and start securing your M5 by 10 millimeter bolts. And there we have our x-axis gantry installed onto our z-axis using our 12 bolts. To continue further assembly of our x-axis, we need to go ahead and gather previously assembled, and we'll go ahead and do that now. Alright, so now you should have your three main base assemblies: your x-z-axis assembly, your x-axis linear rail, your frame and y-axis assemblies that we assembled earlier. So now we're going to go ahead and assemble everything together and finalize our x-axis. First thing you want to do is grab your x-axis C-beam and your z-axis assembly and go ahead and put it onto your C-beam. The next thing you want to do is drop the whole thing in between your y-axis side plates and secure into the plates to your C-beam using your M5 by 15 bolts. Alright, as you can see, we now have our x-axis installed and everything's rolling smoothly. Go ahead and just leave it in the center. We now want to take our two remaining 688 two Z bearings and install them in our Y-axis side plates. They just snap into place and are flush with the plates with zero play. We can now thread our lead screw through the side plate into our anti-backlash nut. Alright, so I almost forgot. Go ahead and thread your lead screw through your bearing, and then as soon as it pokes through your bearing, you want to install an 8mm shim, followed by your 8mm lock collar, and then go ahead and thread it through your anti-backlash nut. And then before you get the lead screw all the way through the bearing on the other plate, you want to install a lock collar and your remaining 8mm shim, and then you can proceed to thread your lead screw all the way through. Just like that. We are now going to be mounting our NEMA 23 motor utilizing our 40mm spacers and our M5 by 50mm bolts. We first want to mount our 1/4 inch to 8mm coupler to our motor. We want to make sure that our wire is facing the rear of our machine. Now that we have our NEMA 23 motor mounted, we can go ahead and secure our lock collar in place. Now we can proceed to tighten our lock collars. And that concludes the entire mechanical build of your C-beam Sphinx CNC router build.